The bridge of the warship hummed quietly as Captain Jake Morrison sat in his command chair, reviewing reports on his screen. And the soft glow of the controls reflected off his tired face as he rubbed his eyes, thinking about how quiet the past 3 months had been with nothing but routine patrols and boring escort missions through empty space, where nothing ever happened, and his crew had grown too comfortable with the peaceful assignments that made them forget they were soldiers trained for war and not tour guides for diplomatic vessels carrying politicians who complained about everything. Lieutenant Amy Peterson suddenly straightened at her station, and her fingers moved quickly across the glowing controls as she isolated an incoming transmission, and her voice cut through the quiet bridge when she called out that they were picking up a distress signal from the Valorian colony on a planet called Epsilon 7, and she said the message reported they were under attack right now and needed immediate help before it was too late, and everyone stopped what they were doing to listen. Commander Greg Hamilton moved from his position at the weapons console and walked closer to the captain's chair with concern written all over his face as he reminded Jake that the Valorians were peaceful allies who had helped humanity establish important trade routes through this dangerous sector of space when nobody else would trust the newcomers from Earth, and they were small, gentle creatures with beautiful crystalline skin that made them look like living gems, and they had welcomed humans with open arms when most other alien species viewed Earth's people with suspicion and fear. Jake nodded slowly and asked how far away they were from the colony, and his tactical officer, Lieutenant Chris Baker, checked his navigation display before answering that they could reach Epsilon 7 in 20 minutes if they pushed the engines to maximum thrust, but there was a serious problem, because the distress call specifically mentioned the Kralton Dominion, and that name made everyone on the bridge tense up with worry and fear, because the Kralton were known throughout the entire galaxy as brutal conquerors who had been expanding their empire aggressively for decades by crushing smaller civilizations and absorbing their resources and technology. Amy continued reading the distress message and reported that the Kralton forces had already destroyed 3 Valorian defense platforms in orbit around the planet, and now they were demanding complete surrender within 1 hour, or they would begin bombarding the cities below with their massive weapons that could turn entire continents into ash and glass and kill millions of innocent civilians, including children and families who had done nothing wrong except exist in space that the Kralton wanted for themselves. Jake stood up from his chair and his mind raced through tactical calculations as he considered their options carefully. And the Thunderstrike was powerful and advanced with experimental weapons and shields that had never been tested in real combat. But she was just one ship against what intelligence reports suggested would be a Kralton battle group of at least 20, or maybe even 30 warships working together in coordinated attack formations that had crushed countless civilizations before, and the nearest human fleet was 4 days away, which meant the Valorians would be dead long before any reinforcements could possibly arrive to help them. Commander Lisa Harper, who served as the ship's intelligence officer, brought up a holographic display in the center of the bridge that showed real-time sensor data from the Valorian satellites still functioning in orbit, and she reported that scanners detected exactly 32 Kralton warships arranged in a standard siege formation around the planet, and their flagship, called the Deathbringer, was a massive dreadnought-class vessel that was twice the size of the Thunderstrike and covered in weapon systems that could destroy cities with single shots, and the odds of winning this fight seemed impossible to everyone watching the display. Greg spoke quietly and suggested they should call for reinforcements even though the nearest human fleet was 4 days away, because maybe they could buy time somehow, or negotiate, or do something other than charging into a battle they couldn't win. But Jake interrupted him and said firmly that 4 days was too long, and the Valorians didn't have 4 days or even 4 hours, because the Kralton deadline was only 60 minutes away, and millions would die if nobody helped them right now, in this moment. Jake turned to face his bridge crew, and he could see the mixture of fear and determination in their eyes as they waited for his orders, and he knew what every tactical manual and military regulation said about situations like this, and all the rules told him to wait for backup and not risk his ship and crew against overwhelming odds. But he also knew something else that was more important than rules and regulations and tactical doctrine written by people who had never faced this choice. He spoke calmly and told them he knew what they were all thinking about how the odds were impossible and every calculation said they should wait for reinforcements. But humanity didn't come out to the stars to play it safe and avoid danger, because they came to prove that Earth's people belonged among the stars and deserved respect. And the Kralthan thought they could terrorize peaceful civilizations with impunity, because nobody had ever stood up to them before and challenged their power. But today that was going to change forever. Jake ordered Chris to set course for Epsilon 7 at maximum speed and called for battle stations, and immediately the ship's alert sirens began wailing throughout every corridor and deck as the crew rushed to their combat positions and throughout. The thunderstrike, hundreds of men and women prepared themselves for a battle that every computer simulation and tactical analysis said they absolutely could not win against such overwhelming enemy numbers. Amy looked up from her console with her face pale but her voice steady as she asked if she should transmit a message to the Valorian colony to let them know that help was coming soon, and Jake nodded and told her to tell them to hold on and stay strong and make sure they knew that Earth remembers its friends and never abandons them, no matter how dangerous the situation becomes. As the thunderstrike accelerated toward the war zone, Jake allowed himself one brief moment of doubt as he thought about his wife Claire back home on Earth and their young daughter Sophie, who had just turned 7 years old and celebrated her birthday. And he had promised to be home next month for her next celebration. But some promises were more important than others, and humanity had been saved from extinction twice in its history by aliens who intervened when they didn't have to, and now it was time to pay that kindness forward. Chris announced they were 19 minutes away from contact with the enemy, and Jake settled back into his command chair and ordered all weapon systems charged and told them to activate the experimental shields that had never been tested in real combat conditions. And he said quietly that whatever happened in the next hour, they needed to make sure it was something the entire galaxy would remember forever. Because this wasn't just about saving one colony, but about showing every civilization in space that humanity stood for something real. The thunderstrike dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Epsilon 7 system, and immediately the tactical display lit up with red contacts showing 32 Kralthan warships hanging in orbit around the beautiful blue-green planet below like vultures waiting to feast, and their dark hulls bristled with weapon emplacements that glowed with barely contained power, and they had formed a perfect blockade formation that ensured nothing could reach or leave the planet's surface without passing through their killing zone. Amy reported that the Kralthan flagship was hailing them and demanding they respond, and Jake ordered her to put it on screen, and the view screen flickered to life, showing the angular reptilian face of a Kralthan commander whose ridge-covered skin was the color of dried blood, and his eyes gleamed with cold intelligence that spoke of countless battles and easy victories. And when he spoke, the translator rendered his hissing voice into flat, emotionless English that somehow made his words sound even more threatening. The Kralthan commander stated that the human vessel had entered a military operations zone and must reverse course immediately, or be destroyed without mercy, and there was amusement in his tone as if the idea of one ship challenging his fleet was the funniest joke he had heard in years, and Jake leaned forward in his chair and identified himself as Captain Jake Morrison, and said firmly that the Valorian people were under human protection, and the Kralthan forces would cease their attack and withdraw from the system right now. The Kralthan commander's lipless mouth stretched into what might have been a smile, as he said that one ship offered no protection against the might of the Dominion, and humanity had been in space for less than 50 years, while the Kralthan had conquered 1,000 worlds over 5,000 years, and humans had no idea what true warfare meant, or how quickly they could be erased from existence. And his tone dripped with contempt for these primitive newcomers who dared challenge ancient power. Jake replied coolly that perhaps it was time for an education, and gave the Kralthan commander 60 seconds to begin withdrawing his forces, or face the consequences, and the alien's eyes narrowed with anger at this disrespect, and he started to say he would enjoy watching the human ship be torn apart. But Jake made a cutting gesture, and Amy closed the channel because he had heard enough empty threats from bullies who thought overwhelming numbers meant they couldn't lose. Greg studied his tactical displays and reported that the Kralthan formation was designed to maximize crossfire potential, and if they advanced, they would be in weapons range of at least 20 ships simultaneously, and the flagship was hanging back behind the front line of smaller cruisers, letting them do the dangerous work while he watched safely from behind. And this was a formation built for siege warfare against static defenses and not for fighting against a fast-moving target that refused to follow predictable patterns. Lisa observed that the Kralthan were clearly expecting them to retreat because their formation was optimized for bombarding planets and not for ship-to-ship combat. and they had grown complacent after centuries of easy victories against enemies, who were too scared to fight back effectively, and Jake nodded slowly as a plan formed in his mind that would use the enemy's overconfidence and rigid tactics against them. Jake told Chris to plot a vector that would take them straight through the thickest concentration of enemy ships at maximum acceleration, and Chris turned in his seat with wide eyes and repeated the order to make sure he heard correctly, because that meant flying directly into the enemy's kill zone where they would be surrounded and taking fire from all directions. And Jake confirmed that was exactly what he wanted, because the Kralthan wouldn't expect such an aggressive move. Jake ordered Amy to transmit on all Kralthan frequencies and tell them the thunderstrike was coming through their formation, and if they were smart, they would move out of the way. And as Chris plotted the attack vector, Jake activated the ship-wide intercom and told all hands that in 30 seconds they were going to do something that was either brilliant or completely insane by charging straight through the Kralthan fleet at full thrust, and he ordered engineering to divert every bit of power to shields and weapons while medical teams prepared for casualties. Greg announced they were 15 seconds from weapons range, and the Kralthan ships were holding position because they thought the human ship was bluffing and couldn't possibly be stupid enough to actually charge into a formation of 32 warships, but they were about to learn that humanity didn't bluff when lives were at stake, and Jake ordered shields to maximum power and told the weapons crews to prepare to return fire on his mark. The view screen showed the Kralthan ships growing larger as the thunderstrike accelerated faster than any ship her size should be capable of moving, and Jake could see the glowing ports of charging weapons as dozens of cannons all aimed at his ship, and behind him he could hear the nervous breathing of his bridge crew, who trusted him completely, but still understood they were flying into what looked like certain death. Greg called out that the enemy was firing, and the first Kralthan salvo lit up space like a small sun, as dozens of plasma bolts and missile trails converged on the thunderstrike's position with enough firepower to vaporize a city. But the experimental shields flared brilliant blue and absorbed the impact, and the ship shuddered violently but held steady, and Greg reported shields were at 78% and holding while the Kralthan recharged for another volley. Jake ordered all forward batteries to return fire and show the enemy what human weapons could do, and the thunderstrike's railguns opened up with a thunderous roar that echoed through the ship's superstructure as solid projectiles accelerated to a fraction of light speed, tore through space and crossed the distance to the Kralthan line in microseconds. And the lead enemy cruiser's shields flashed once and twice, and then collapsed entirely as the kinetic rounds punched through its armor like paper. Explosions blossomed along the cruiser's hull as the railgun slugs tore through vital systems and power conduits, and within seconds the Kralthan ship was breaking apart with debris spinning off into space, and Greg shouted that the target was destroyed, and he sounded genuinely shocked because their weapons had proven far more effective than intelligence had predicted, and the Kralthan shields couldn't handle the kinetic impact of solid rounds moving at relativistic speeds. Jake ordered them to adjust targeting and focus fire on the forward vessels to clear a path, and the thunderstrike plunged deeper into the Kralthan formation, with her weapon systems working at a pace that shouldn't have been possible as the advanced targeting system developed from decades of human warfare experience tracked multiple targets simultaneously, and every shot found its mark with devastating precision that came from computer-assisted accuracy. A second Kralthan cruiser exploded as a railgun round penetrated its reactor core, and a third lost its main engines and began tumbling out of formation, and the Kralthan fleet, which had seemed so overwhelming just moments before, suddenly found itself in chaos as their rigid formation doctrine collapsed, and Lisa reported they were breaking formation because the ships on the flanks were trying to reposition but getting in each other's way. Jake allowed himself a tight smile because the Kralthan had grown complacent after centuries of easy victories against enemies who followed predictable patterns, and they had forgotten that in real combat, doctrine and formation meant nothing if your enemy refused to follow the expected script. And Chris guided the thunderstrike through the enemy fleet like a dancer weaving between slower partners, and every time the Kralthan tried to mask their fire, the human ship was already somewhere else, leaving another crippled cruiser in her wake. Amy announced an incoming transmission from the Kralthan flagship and said the commander wanted to talk, but Jake replied that he wasn't interested in talking anymore because they were done with words, and Greg reported 7 enemy ships were down, and 4 more were heavily damaged and trailing atmosphere from hull breaches. But the flagship was moving and coming about to engage them directly with its massive weapons. Jake's eyes locked onto the tactical display showing the massive Kralthan dreadnought turning its bulk toward them, and its weapon ports glowed with barely contained power. And this was the real test, because everything up to now had been fighting. Smaller cruisers. But the flagship was a true monster that had destroyed countless civilizations, and Jake activated the intercom and said quietly that this was it. And it was time to show the Kralthan what humanity was made of, and prove that courage and intelligence could defeat brute force. The Kralthan flagship Deathbringer was a monument to intimidation and destruction that stretched over 2 kilometers long and dwarfed the Thunderstrike by a factor of 3, and its hull was covered in scars from 100 battles where each mark represented a defeated civilization that no longer existed, and massive cannons studded its surface with weapons that could reduce entire cities to ash with single salvos, and just looking at it made several bridge crew members catch their breath. Greg reported that the flagship was charging its main guns and the energy readings were off the scale and climbing higher by the second, and he added with tension in his voice that if those weapons hit them directly, then shields or no shields, they would be torn apart and scattered across space. And Jake studied the tactical display carefully, while his mind raced through possibilities and calculations looking for any weakness he could exploit. Jake asked how long until the flagship could fire, and Greg checked his sensors before answering that the main cannon needed 45 seconds to reach full charge, but the secondary batteries were already in range and tracking their ship, and those weapons alone were powerful enough to cripple them if enough shots connected. And Jake nodded and told Chris to bring them about on a heading directly at the flagship at full thrust. Several bridge officers turned to stare at their captain in disbelief, because charging at a dreadnought seemed like suicide. And Lieutenant Karen Phillips spoke up hesitantly and pointed out that they were about to fly straight at a ship 3 times their size with weapons that could obliterate them. And Jake replied that he was counting on the flagship being too big and too slow to track them at close range. Jake explained that the massive main cannon was designed for long-distance bombardment of planets and stationary targets, and if they got in close, then half the flagship's weapons couldn't target them without hitting its own ship. And Greg's face showed understanding as he realized they were going to use the enemy's size against them, because bigger wasn't always better in a knife fight. And Jake ordered all forward missiles readied, because they were going to launch everything they had. As soon as they reached optimal range, the Thunderstrike accelerated toward the Deathbringer, while weaving through the scattered remains of the Kralthan formation, and the remaining enemy cruisers attempted to intercept, but they were too slow and too disorganized after losing so many. Ships in their rigid tactical doctrine had no answer for an enemy that kept doing unexpected things. Greg announced 20 seconds to missile range, and reported that the flagship was trying to track them, but they were moving too fast, and the massive turrets couldn't rotate quickly enough to follow their course, and the secondary batteries were firing, but most shots were missing, and the few energy blasts that did connect with the shields were absorbed with minimal impact. Jake watched the dreadnought fill the viewscreen as its massive bulk blotted out the stars, and he could see movement on its hull as defensive turrets tracked desperately, trying to acquire a lock on the approaching human ship. And for the first time since this battle started, he could see that the Kralthan were genuinely afraid, because their invincible flagship was about to be attacked by something they couldn't hit. Greg confirmed missile locks and reported all tubes were loaded and ready, and Jake gave the order to fire, and the Thunderstrike shuddered as every missile tube released simultaneously, and dozens of warheads streaked across the void with their targeting systems locked onto specific weak points on the Deathbringer's hull that the tactical computer had identified from scanning their armor. The Kralthan point defense systems engaged immediately and shot down several missiles, but there were simply too many targets coming too fast, and the first wave impacted the dreadnought's forward weapon arrays in a series of brilliant explosions that lit up space, and secondary detonations rippled along the hull as ammunition stores cooked off and exploded. Greg shouted that they had direct hits and the enemy's main cannon was destroyed, along with multiple secondary systems going offline, and Jake ordered Chris to bring them around for another pass while telling all railguns to target the flagships. Engines and the Thunderstrike swept past the Deathbringer's bulk at such close range that the crew could see individual Kralthan through viewports, and their reptilian faces were twisted in shock and fury. The railgun spoke again, and solid rounds moving at incredible velocity tore into the dreadnought's engine section with brutal efficiency, and Lisa reported that the enemy reactor was destabilizing, and they were venting atmosphere from multiple decks and the massive flagship that had terrified entire sectors of space for decades was now crippled and drifting. Amy straightened at her console and reported an incoming transmission from the Valorian colony, saying the Kralthan ground forces were beginning to withdraw to their landing ships because they could see what was happening in orbit, and their supposedly invincible fleet was being systematically torn apart by a single human warship, and their confidence was shattering. Jake asked for a status report on the remaining Kralthan vessels, and Greg checked his displays before answering that 8 cruisers were still combat capable, but they were falling back and forming a defensive perimeter around their crippled flagship, and he believed they were preparing to retreat because their morale had completely collapsed. Jake said coldly that the Kralthan couldn't retreat yet because they had come here to terrorize peaceful people, and they needed to understand there were consequences for attacking innocents, and he activated the communication system to address all enemy vessels directly. Jake identified himself and told the Kralthan forces that they had entered this system with 32 warships thinking they could attack human allies with impunity, but they had miscalculated badly because they thought humanity was weak since Earth's people were new to the stars, but they were wrong, and now their flagship was crippled and 7 cruisers were destroyed. He continued and said the Kralthan had 2 choices now, and they could surrender and face trial for their attack on the Valorian people, or they could continue fighting and be destroyed completely, and he gave them 60 seconds to decide their fate, and then cut the transmission and waited. The bridge was silent except for the soft hum of the ship's systems and the occasional beep from sensor stations, and every eye watched the tactical display to see what the Kralthan would do and whether they would choose survival or pride. Amy spoke softly and reported they were receiving a transmission from the Kralthan flagship, and it was a surrender offer, and a collective breath of relief swept through the bridge crew, because they had done it, and against impossible odds they had forced an entire enemy fleet to surrender without losing a single human life. Jake told Amy to inform them that surrender was accepted but on human terms, and all Kralthan vessels must power down their weapons and shields immediately, and any ship that attempted to flee or engage would be destroyed without warning, and they would remain in position until a coalition peacekeeping force arrived to process them. Amy reported that the Kralthan were acknowledging and all enemy ships were powering down their weapons, and Jake finally allowed himself to relax slightly as he settled back into his command chair and told Lisa to send a full report to Earth Command and make sure they understood exactly what happened here today. Greg kept all weapons hot and maintained target locks on every Kralthan ship just in case any of them decided to try something stupid, but Jake didn't think they would because their spirit was broken, and they had learned that humanity didn't back down from bullies no matter how powerful those bullies thought they were. Commander Karen Phillips approached the captain's chair, and her expression mixed relief with awe, as she pointed out that they had just defeated an entire Kralthan battle group with a single ship, and this was going to change everything about how the galaxy viewed humanity, and Jake nodded slowly because he was counting on that change. Jake said that the Kralthan had been bullying smaller species for centuries because nobody was willing to challenge them. But today they learned that humanity doesn't tolerate bullies, and hopefully the rest of the galaxy had been watching and would understand that Earth's people were serious about defending their friends and protecting the innocent even when it meant fighting against overwhelming odds. The bridge of the Thunderstrike hummed with subdued activity 3 hours after the battle ended, and the crew maintained their vigil over the defeated Kralthan fleet, while the adrenaline finally began wearing off and was replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that came from surviving what should have been certain death, and everybody moved a little slower as the reality of what they had accomplished started to sink in. Amy reported that they were receiving multiple transmissions from across the sector, and her voice carried disbelief as she said, everyone wanted to know what happened at Epsilon 7, and Jake asked how many civilizations were trying to contact them, and she answered that 47 different species had sent messages so far, and the number kept growing, because the Valorians were transmitting their sensor logs to the entire coalition. Before Jake could respond, the communication console chimed with an incoming priority signal, and Amy checked the source before reporting with wide eyes that it was High Command, and specifically Admiral Kate Peterson herself, who commanded Earth's entire space fleet, and Jake straightened in his chair and told her to put the transmission through. The view screen showed Admiral Peterson, who was a stern woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen humanity's worst and finest moments, and right now those eyes held an expression Jake couldn't quite read as she said his name. and told him she had read his after-action report 3 times, and still couldn't quite believe that he had engaged a Kralthan battle group of 32 vessels and forced their surrender with 0 casualties on the human side. Jake confirmed it was true and explained that the Kralthan tactics were predictable, and their technology was less advanced than intelligence had suggested, and their experimental weapons and shields had performed beyond all expectations, and the enemy simply wasn't prepared for how humanity fought wars. Admiral Peterson leaned forward and asked if Jake had any idea what he had done, because the Kralthan Dominion hadn't lost a major engagement in over 200 years, and he had just shattered their reputation for invincibility in a single afternoon, and the political implications were enormous. Jake replied with respect that the Kralthan needed to be stopped, and the Valorians were human allies who deserved protection, and Admiral Peterson said she wasn't criticizing him but congratulating him, because what he did was going to reshape galactic politics completely, and they were already receiving messages from a dozen species who wanted to establish formal alliances with humanity. The Admiral explained that the Coalition was calling an emergency session to discuss the Kralthan threat, and humanity had been given a seat at the table that would have taken decades of careful diplomacy to achieve through normal channels, and Jake had accomplished it in one afternoon by proving that human military doctrine could compete with species that had been fighting wars for millennia. Jake said the crew performed magnificently, and every single person on the ship deserved recognition for their courage and skill, and Admiral Peterson assured him they would all receive appropriate honors, but right now she needed him to maintain position at Epsilon 7, because a Coalition fleet was en route to take custody of the Kralthan prisoners and should arrive in about 18 hours. The Admiral's expression grew more serious, and she told Jake to be prepared for what came next, because Earth was going to want to study everything about this battle in minute detail, including the weapons' effectiveness and tactical decisions and everything else, because he had proven that human military thinking could stand against ancient civilizations, and that would have implications nobody could imagine yet. After the transmission ended, Greg approached with a datapad containing preliminary casualty reports from the Valorian colony, and he reported that thanks to human intervention, the Kralthan ground forces had withdrawn before completing their assault, and estimated civilian casualties were less than 200, when projections suggested the Kralthan would have killed millions if nobody had stopped them. Jake closed his eyes briefly and let that number sink in, because 200 deaths was still too many. But compared to what could have happened, it was a miracle. And he told Greg to make sure those families received full support from Earth, including medical assistance and reconstruction aid and whatever else they needed. Greg confirmed it was already being arranged and then added quietly that the crew was calling this the miracle at Epsilon 7 and saying that humanity had rewritten the rules of space combat, and Jake replied that they had gotten lucky because the Kralthan were overconfident and used outdated tactics, and against a more adaptive enemy things could have gone very differently. Lisa suddenly called out from her station that she was detecting incoming ships and multiple contacts had just emerged from faster than light at the edge of the system, and the bridge crew tensed immediately as hands moved to weapon controls, and Jake asked sharply if they were Kralthan reinforcements coming for revenge. Lisa studied her sensors intently before reporting negative and saying these were Coalition vessels with Valorian and Centauri and Tyrellian signatures, and she added with confusion that it wasn't a military fleet but civilian ships, and there were hundreds of them coming from all over the sector. Amy's console lit up with incoming transmissions, and she reported that all the civilian ships were hailing them and saying they had come to witness and to see with their own eyes the ship that defeated the Kralthan, and Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he realized word had spread so fast that civilian populations across entire star systems were traveling to Epsilon 7 just to see the thunderstrike. Greg murmured that this was bigger than anyone thought, because they hadn't just won a battle but had given hope to every species that had been terrorized by the Kralthan for centuries, and they had shown the galaxy that the Dominion could be beaten and wasn't invincible after all. Jake walked to the view screen and looked out at the stars beyond, knowing that countless civilizations were watching and waiting to see what humanity would do next, and they had proven themselves in combat. But that was only the beginning, and now came the real challenge of living up to the expectations they had created. Jake ordered Lisa to send a message to the civilian ships thanking them for their support, but asking them to maintain a safe distance because this was still an active military situation, and he told Amy to start preparing a formal statement for the coalition, making it clear that humanity wasn't looking to replace the Kralthan as the new dominant military power, but was here as partners and protectors of peace. As the bridge crew returned to their duties, Jake allowed himself a moment of reflection, because less than a day ago, they had been on routine patrol, and now they had changed the course of galactic history, and the weight of that responsibility was immense, but so was the opportunity, because humanity had proven itself worthy of standing among the stars. Amy said softly that there was one more transmission he should see, and it was from the Kralthan flagship, and their commander wanted to speak with Jake privately, and Jake raised an eyebrow at the unusual request before telling her to put it through to his ready room. Jake entered the small office adjacent to the bridge and activated the secure communication panel, and the reptilian face of the Kralthan commander appeared, but the arrogance from their first conversation was completely gone, and now the alien looked defeated and profoundly shaken. The Kralthan identified himself as Commander Vex of the Deathbringer, and said he had commanded Kralthan forces for 30 cycles, and conquered 17 worlds, and defeated 40 different species in combat. But until today, he had never experienced defeat, and didn't know what it felt like to lose. Jake waited silently and let the alien continue talking, and Vex explained that the Kralthan way of war hadn't changed in 1,000 years, because they perfected tactics through repetition, and overwhelmed enemies through superior numbers and firepower. But they didn't adapt, and today he learned that was a fatal weakness. Jake asked if there was a point to this conversation, and Vex replied that he was giving a warning, because humanity had humiliated the Kralthan Dominion, and their leadership would not accept this defeat, and they would study what happened here, and they would adapt, and they would come for Earth with everything they had, and wouldn't make the same mistakes again. Jake felt a cold knot form in his stomach, but kept his voice steady as he said, "The Kralthan should let them come, because humanity doesn't start fights but always finishes them." And Vex's eyes gleamed with something that might have been respect. As he said, Jake was brave, but bravery wasn't enough against the full might of the Dominion. The transmission ended, leaving Jake staring at the blank screen, and thinking about how the victory at Epsilon 7 had come at a price he hadn't considered, because they had painted a target on humanity's back that would never go away. But looking out at his crew through the ready room window and seeing their pride and determination, Jake knew that humanity was ready for whatever came next, because they had faced the impossible today, and won. The Coalition Assembly Hall was the largest artificial structure in known space, and it orbited the neutral world of Sanctuary Prime, where representatives from 300 civilizations gathered to debate policy and settle disputes and shape the future of galactic civilization. And today, for the first time in its 2,000-year history, a human was addressing the full assembly. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the central podium wearing his dress uniform, and feeling acutely aware that billions of beings across hundreds of worlds were watching this broadcast, and he would have preferred to be back on his ship, but Admiral Peterson had insisted that humanity needed to present its case before the Coalition, and Jake was the face of that case whether he liked it or not. The assembly was an impressive sight, with tiered seating rising in concentric circles around the central floor, and each section was filled with representatives of different species, and some were humanoid, while others were so alien that Jake could barely comprehend their forms, but all of them were focused on him with an intensity that was almost physical. The Centauri ambassador, who was a tall being with 4 arms and silver skin, activated his microphone and asked Jake how he responded to accusations of reckless military action that could have triggered a larger conflict, because the Kralthan Dominion claimed the attack on their fleet was unprovoked aggression. Jake had expected this question, because the Kralthan had been spinning the story for the past week and trying to paint themselves as victims rather than aggressors, and he replied with respect that the facts spoke for themselves, because the Kralthan attacked the Valorian colony without provocation or declaration of war, and demanded surrender while threatening orbital bombardment of civilian population centers. A representative from a species Jake didn't recognize spoke up, and its voice was translated through the chamber's systems, and it asked whether such destructive force was necessary, because humanity had destroyed 7 Kralthan warships and crippled their flagship. Jake replied firmly that every shot they fired was in defense of the Valorian people and in response to hostile action, and they offered the Kralthan the opportunity to withdraw peacefully, But the enemy refused, and they defeated them because they had to, and not because they wanted to. And when the Kralthans surrendered, that surrender was accepted, and they were treated according to coalition law. The Valorian ambassador, who was a diminutive figure with crystalline skin that refracted the chamber's light into rainbow patterns, stood and spoke with passion about how humanity spoke truth, and the Valorian people owed their very existence to the courage of Captain Morrison and his crew, because the Kralthan would have annihilated their colony without a second thought. A murmur ran through the assembly, and Jake saw several representatives nodding in agreement, but not everyone was convinced, and the Kralthan delegate, who was a scarred warrior in ornate armor, rose to his feet, and his voice was a low growl as he claimed the human defeated their fleet through trickery and deception, showing they couldn't be trusted. Jake felt his temper flare but kept his voice level, as he pointed out that Epsilon 7 was never part of the Kralthan sphere of influence, and the Valorians were an independent species under coalition protection, and as for trickery, he called it tactics and superior strategy that defeated a numerically superior force. The Kralthan delegate hissed and asked what gave humanity the right to interfere in matters that had been settled for centuries when their species had been in space for less than a human lifetime. And Jake stepped forward, and his voice rang through the chamber as he said justice gave them the right and morality gave them the right. Jake continued and said that humanity brought the conviction that might does not make right, and that the strong have an obligation to protect the weak, and that civilization means more than just technological advancement, but means standing up for what's right even when it's difficult, and the chamber fell silent. Jake pressed on and said that for too long species like the Kralthan had operated with impunity, because nobody was willing to challenge them, and they had grown comfortable with the idea that they could take what they wanted and destroy anyone who stood in their way. But that ended now. He explained that humanity didn't come to the stars to conquer, but to build and to learn and to forge friendships with species who shared their values, but they would not tolerate bullies no matter how powerful those bullies thought they were, and his words echoed in the vast chamber. The Centauri ambassador asked if humanity could back up their strong words because they won one battle against an overconfident enemy, but what would happen when they faced the full might of the Kralthan war machine, and it was the question everyone wanted answered. Jake took a breath and chose his words carefully as he admitted that humanity was young and still learning the ways of galactic civilization, and they didn't have the largest fleet or the most advanced technology, but they had something else, and that was the willingness to stand up for their principles no matter the cost. He explained that the Thunderstrike defeated the Kralthan fleet at Epsilon 7, but they had already incorporated lessons from that battle into their training and doctrine, and were developing new weapons and new strategies and new ways of fighting. And the Kralthan might study what happened, but humanity wasn't standing still. Jake turned to address the entire assembly, and his voice filled with conviction as he said, humanity offered the coalition a partnership based on mutual respect and shared values, and they would stand with any civilization that faced aggression, and would share their technology and tactical knowledge with allies, and would prove battle by battle, if necessary, that the age of conquest was over. The Valorian ambassador stood again and formally proposed an alliance with humanity, saying they had seen human courage and honor, and would be privileged to stand beside them. And to Jake's surprise, several other delegates rose as well, including the Centauri and the Tyrellians and even some species he had never heard of. The Kralthan delegate looked around the chamber with obvious fury as he saw the tide turning against his people, and he snarled that they were making a grave mistake by choosing to align themselves with primitives over the Kralthan, and warned that the Dominion would not forget this insult. The Centauri ambassador, who also served as the assembly's chairman, spoke with steel in his voice and asked if that was a threat, and the Kralthan seemed to realize he had gone too far, but replied that it was a warning because the Dominion had tolerated coalition interference out of respect for tradition, but if they chose to elevate these humans, then the Kralthan would reconsider their membership. The chairman replied coldly that if the Kralthan Dominion found the coalition's principles of mutual defense and peaceful coexistence incompatible with its ambitions, then perhaps it was time they parted ways, and the Kralthan delegate stood frozen for a long moment before turning and stalking from the chamber with his armor clanking with each furious step. As the doors closed behind him, the chairman turned to Jake and formally welcomed humanity as a full-member civilization with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed, and said that human actions had demonstrated both the courage and the Moral clarity the coalition valued, and the chamber erupted in applause that came in dozens of different forms. Jake stood there overwhelmed by the moment and realizing that in the space of a week, humanity had gone from newcomers on the galactic stage to key players in an ancient political structure, and the weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders. Later, in a private reception, the Valorian ambassador approached Jake with a crystal glass filled with something that glowed faintly blue, and said she wanted to speak away from the formal setting, and introduced herself as Kira, and thanked him for what he said about standing up for what's right, because it resonated deeply with her people. Kira explained that the Valorians had lived under the shadow of Kralthan aggression for generations, always knowing that one day the Dominion might decide to conquer them, and humanity gave them hope that they didn't have to live in fear anymore. And Jake said simply that nobody should have to live in fear. Kira asked if Jake understood what he had started because the Kralthan delegate wasn't bluffing about their response, and by embarrassing them so publicly, humanity had made an enemy of one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy, and they would come for Earth eventually. Jake nodded slowly and admitted he knew that. But they didn't have a choice because if they had walked away from Epsilon 7, they would be telling the galaxy that humanity only stands for what's convenient and only helps friends when it's safe. And that wasn't who they were. Kira said softly that humanity was truly remarkable because most species would have calculated the risk and decided it was too great. But instead they calculated what was right and chose to act on principle rather than fear. Over the next few hours, Jake found himself in conversation with delegates from across the galaxy, who all wanted to know the same things about humanity's intentions and military strength and whether they would really stand against the Kralthan if they retaliated, and to each Jake gave the same answer that humanity sought peace but wouldn't shy away from defending its principles. As the reception wound down, Jake found a quiet corner and activated his communicator, and Admiral Peterson's face appeared on the small screen asking how it went, and Jake,